Hey everyone! Just a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button if you're enjoying my stories. It really helps me know you're into the content. Thanks for tuning in, and let's dive right in. There's a certain chill that comes with death. Not just the kind you feel when you walk into a morgue or when the first gust of winter catches you off guard, but the kind that gets inside your bones and stays there. I've lived in that cold my entire life, and no matter how many layers I wear, I can never seem to shake it. That's the thing about working in a funeral home. Death becomes less of an abstract concept and more of a constant companion. Every day, you're reminded of how fragile life is, how easily it slips away, and how much of a mess it leaves behind. Most people only think about funerals when they lose someone, but for me, it's my job. Day in, day out. The dead come in, their families weep, we make everything look nice and neat, and then they're gone. It's a cycle, one I've never liked, but it's the family business. And I'm stuck in it. For now, anyway. My name is Allison, and I've been working at Thornfield Funeral Home for about 5 years now. I didn't really have a choice in the matter. My parents own the place, and when I graduated college with a degree in accounting, my mom practically begged me to come work here. It's temporary, she'd said, just until we retire. Then you can do whatever you want. But temporary turned into years, and now I'm 27, still stuck behind a desk doing paperwork for the dead. I hate it. Not just the paperwork, though that's mind-numbingly dull, but the whole atmosphere. It's cold, sterile, suffocating. I've never understood how my family could be so at ease with all of it. My dad loves his role as the driver, ferrying coffins back and forth like it's just another delivery job. My brother, Daniel, is always upbeat, even while rearranging chairs or hauling caskets like they're pieces of furniture. And my mom, well, she's the face of the business, the one who consoles grieving families and plans the perfect send-offs. She thrives on it. Me? I just want to get out. Travel the world, see something other than this small gray town and its endless funerals. But I can't leave. Not yet. My parents are counting on me to take over when they retire, and Daniel has big plans of his own. He's saving up to open a gym, of all things, and he'll need the money from the funeral home to make it happen. So here I am, doing my part, even if it feels like I'm slowly being buried alive. Of course, it's not just the monotony that gets to me. There's something off about this place. Always has been. When I was a kid, I thought it was just my imagination, but the older I got, the harder it was to ignore. The shadows here seem to move when you're not looking. The air gets heavier at night, like something is pressing down on you. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can hear whispers. It started with the rules. I don't remember exactly when we discovered them, but it was a long time ago, before I even started working here. At first, we thought it was just coincidence. Strange things kept happening, little accidents and unexplained noises. Then there were the requests, the whispers from the coffins. The dead aren't supposed to talk, but somehow they do. Not always, but enough that we've learned to listen. They don't say much, and when they do, it's barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. But their demands are always clear. Bring them a certain object, deliver a message to their family, follow their instructions to the letter. If we don't, well, bad things happen. I still remember the first time my dad ignored a request. He'd brought in a young woman who had passed in a car accident. She'd whispered something about wanting her engagement ring in the coffin with her. My dad thought it was nonsense, probably a trick of the mind, so he brushed it off. The next morning, the ring was missing from her fiancé's house. They found it on her finger at the viewing, even though no one had put it there. After that, we didn't question the rules. We don't talk about them with outsiders, of course. Who would believe us? The official line is that we're just a regular funeral home, doing what funeral homes do. But we know better. The dead have their own rules, their own ways of making sure we obey. And lately, it feels like they're becoming more demanding. This morning, I found myself staring at the schedule for the week, my stomach sinking as I noticed the name at the top of the list. Charles Whitaker, a wealthy businessman, recently deceased. His family was one of the wealthiest in town, known for their scandals and secrets. The kind of family that's good for business, because they spare no expense, but bad for everything else. I had a feeling this one was going to be different. When Charles Whitaker's name came across my desk, I knew it was going to be trouble. Big names always are. They come with complicated families, inflated egos, and endless demands. But this wasn't just any big name. This was Charles Whitaker. He was the kind of man everyone knew but no one liked. A real estate mogul who built half the town, tore down the other half, and left a trail of ruined lives in his wake. Scandals clung to him like shadows, rumors of bribery, extortion, even a few whispers about missing business rivals. The kind of whispers people only tell behind closed doors. When he died, the circumstances were as murky as his reputation. Officially, it was a heart attack, but the papers were already buzzing with conspiracy theories. Was it stress? Revenge? Something darker? No one knew for sure, and no one would ever admit it if they did. I tried to push it out of my mind as I worked through the rest of the day, but when my dad and brother returned with his body that evening, I felt it. The weight. They arrived just after sundown, the long black hearse pulling into the driveway like a snake slithering into its burrow. I was in the office when I heard the engine cut off and the slam of the doors. The sound sent a shiver through me, though I couldn't explain why. "Allison, come give us a hand," my brother Daniel called from the back of the hearse. Reluctantly, I got up and made my way outside. The air was cold, but not the usual kind of January chill. It was heavier, sharper, like it had teeth. The kind that makes your breath feel like glass in your throat. Daniel and my dad were already unloading the coffin. It was massive, polished mahogany with gold trim, the kind of thing that screamed money. Even in death, Charles Whitaker was making a statement. "You feel that?" Daniel muttered, glancing at me as they hefted the coffin onto the gurney. I nodded. I didn't have to ask what he meant. We all felt it. The air around the coffin was wrong. It wasn't just heavy. It was charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. I wanted to step back, but I forced myself to help guide the gurney through the funeral home doors. "Straight to the viewing room," Dad said, his voice tight. We rolled the coffin into the center of the room, where it would stay until the service tomorrow. The family had spared no expense: white lilies, velvet curtains, the works. It was all ready to go. I expected my dad and Daniel to leave after that, but they hesitated, lingering in the room like they were waiting for something. "Let's go," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "The sooner we're done, the better." Dad gave me a look, but he didn't argue. We all knew the rules. We didn't stay in the viewing room after dark. By the time I made it back to the office, the unease was still gnawing at me. I tried to focus on the paperwork, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the coffin, to the way the air had felt, to the stories I'd heard about Whitaker, the rumors, the secrets, the enemies he'd made. And then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind. It was faint, barely audible, like someone speaking through a crack in the wall. But the longer I sat there, the louder it got. My stomach twisted as I realized where it was coming from. The viewing room. I didn't want to go. I told myself to stay put, to wait until morning, to let someone else deal with it. But something pulled me out of my chair, through the dimly lit hallway, and to the edge of the doorway. The coffin was open. I froze. My dad and brother hadn't opened it. That much I knew. But there it was, the lid pushed back, the rich man sitting upright inside. His eyes were open, but they weren't normal. They were cloudy, glassy, the kind of eyes you'd see on a fish pulled from the water. His lips moved, but the words were soft, barely more than a rasp. I couldn't make them out until I forced myself to step closer. "I have requests," he whispered. My throat was dry. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. "The wine," he said, "from my study. Bring it to me." I nodded without thinking, my body acting on instinct. "A letter," he continued. His voice crackled like dry leaves. "It is in my desk. You will deliver it to Emily." "Emily?" My voice came out hoarse. "Who's Emily?" He didn't answer. Instead, his lips curled into a faint, brittle smile. "And one more thing," he said. "After midnight, do not look into my eyes." I backed out of the room without another word. My legs felt like they might give out, but I managed to make it to the office and shut the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my ears. The rules always follow the rules, but this time they felt different. The wine, the letter, the midnight warning. Something told me Charles Whitaker wasn't just another dead man. He was something worse. I didn't sleep. Not that I expected to after hearing Charles Whitaker's final requests, but the restless hours that followed felt like punishment for even being in the same building as him. I spent most of the night pacing in the office, my mind replaying his words over and over again. The wine, the letter, the midnight warning. Each one felt like a test, a trap waiting to snap shut if I stepped wrong. I told myself it was simple. Do what he asked, don't make mistakes, and get through the night. But then I opened the letter. It was tucked neatly into a sealed envelope that I found exactly where Whitaker said it would be, in the top drawer of his desk, nestled among stacks of legal documents and faded family photos. I knew I shouldn't look. The rules didn't say anything about reading the letter, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I broke the seal. A faint smell of expensive cologne wafted out, the kind that clung to a person like a signature. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in neat, slanted handwriting. To Emily. Burn the estate. Burn everything. Do not let them inherit. You know why. My breath caught. The Whitaker estate was worth millions. Land, properties, investments. It was a small empire. And here he was, asking to raze it all to the ground. Emily, whoever she was, had been entrusted with a secret that could destroy his family. I stared at the letter for what felt like an eternity. My pulse was pounding. My thoughts spiraling. Could I really deliver this? Could I be the one to set off a bomb that big? Ollie, Daniel's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned to see him leaning against the doorframe, his face pale and drawn. What are you doing? He asked. Nothing, I lied, quickly folding the letter and slipping it back into the envelope. You okay? I wasn't, but I nodded anyway. Yeah, just tired. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Dad's gone to bed, he said. I'm staying up for a bit, just in case. You should get some sleep. Right, I murmured. But we both knew I wouldn't. The hours dragged on, each tick of the clock louder than the last. Midnight came and went, the silence in the funeral home growing heavier with each passing minute. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, finding the wine, preparing the letter for delivery, but my nerves were shot. Around 12:30, I heard it. A creak. Faint but unmistakable, coming from the viewing room. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, but my legs moved on their own. I stepped into the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I saw Daniel. He was standing in the doorway of the viewing room, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the open coffin. Daniel, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. I stepped closer, each movement feeling like wading through quicksand. Daniel, I said again, louder this time. He turned to me, and the look on his face made my blood run cold. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open, his skin pale as ash. I didn't mean to, he stammered. What did you do? He shook his head, his hands trembling. I looked. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. No, I breathed. Behind him, the rich man moved. It wasn't subtle. His head jerked toward us, his glassy eyes fixing on Daniel. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, wider than it should have been, the skin pulling taut over his teeth. The lights flickered, and the air seemed to vibrate with a low, guttural hum. Get back, I hissed, grabbing Daniel's arm and yanking him away from the doorway. But it was too late. The rich man's body lurched forward, his movements unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Rattling sound filled the room, a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but something far worse. The lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. In the chaos that followed, I don't remember much, just fragments. The sound of footsteps echoing where there shouldn't have been any. The oppressive weight in the air, so heavy it felt like it was crushing my chest. And then the voices. They came from below. The basement. My family doesn't talk about the basement. Not really. It's where we keep the bodies that haven't moved on, the ones whose rules were broken. Most of the time, they're quiet, just still, lifeless husks. But when something like this happens, when the balance is disrupted, they wake up. I heard them before I saw them, faint whispers, growing louder and louder, until they were an almost deafening cacophony. Ollie, Daniel whispered, clutching my arm. What's happening? The basement, I said, my voice trembling. They're waking up. He stared at me, the panic in his eyes mirroring my own. We need to get Dad, he said. No, I said quickly. We can't leave them. If they get out... I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. We both knew what would happen if the not moved-on corpses escaped. The funeral home was a fragile balance, held together by obedience to the rules, and tonight, that balance had been shattered. The funeral home felt alive in the worst possible way. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls, every whisper seeping from the basement crawled under my skin. This wasn't just the usual tension we felt during a restless night. This was a full-blown nightmare. "They're awake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel and I stood in the hallway, frozen as the sounds from below grew louder. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was banging, heavy, deliberate, angry. "I told you not to look," I snapped at him, my fear spilling over into anger. "I didn't mean to," he shot back, his voice breaking. "It just happened." Before I could respond, another loud thud reverberated through the building. It came from the basement door at the end of the hall. "We need Dad," Daniel said, starting toward the stairs. I grabbed his arm. "No, if you leave they'll get out. We have to stop them here." He hesitated, torn between panic and reason. But before either of us could decide what to do, the lights flickered again. This time they didn't come back on. The darkness was suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The weak beam of light cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, making everything look more sinister than it already was. "Where's Mom?" Daniel asked. "She was in the supply room," I said, forcing myself to move. "Let's find her." We made our way through the darkened hallways, the banging from the basement growing louder with each step. The air was heavy, almost sticky, and the whispers followed us like a cruel taunt. When we found Mom, she was crouched in the supply room, clutching a rosary in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Mom!" Daniel exclaimed, rushing to her. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her voice sharp and panicked. "Do you hear them? Do you hear them?" "We hear them," I said, kneeling beside her. "Mom, we need a plan. What do we do?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "They haven't been this angry since the McAllister girl." The mention of that name sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know all the details, but I'd heard enough to piece it together. Years ago, a young woman named Clara McAllister had died under mysterious circumstances. Her family's rules were simple: tell her boyfriend she loved him, and leave a red rose in her coffin. But her father had refused to deliver the message, and the rose never made it in. That night, Clara's corpse had torn itself free from the coffin, and the aftermath had nearly destroyed our family and our business. "Mom," I said again, more firmly this time. "What do we do? How do we stop them?" She gripped the rosary tighter, her knuckles white. You have to fix the rules. Even if they're broken, you have to follow them. It's the only way." "But we can't unsee what Daniel saw," I said, my voice trembling. "What do we do about that?" Before she could answer, another deafening bang shook the walls. This time, it wasn't the basement door. It was coming from the viewing room. "The rich man," I whispered. Daniel and I exchanged a look, then bolted down the hallway. The door to the viewing room was ajar, creaking ominously in the darkness. When we stepped inside, I immediately regretted it. Charles Whitaker's corpse was no longer lying peacefully in the coffin. He was sitting upright, his glassy eyes fixed on us. His grin had widened, and the air around him was thick with a cold, suffocating energy. "You've broken the rules," he rasped, his voice like dry paper tearing. "And now, they rise." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "How do we fix this?" He tilted his head, his grin widening. "You follow the rules, exactly as I gave them. Deliver the wine, deliver the letter, do not look." "It's too late for that," Daniel snapped. "I already—" "Silence!" Whitaker's voice boomed, cutting him off. The room seemed to shudder with the force of his anger. Daniel stumbled back, clutching his chest as if the air had been knocked out of him. "There is a way," Whitaker said, his voice lowering to a hiss. "But it will cost you." "What do you mean?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "A blood offering," he said. "One of you must give willingly, a drop for each sin." I stared at him, horrified. "You mean—" He grinned wider, if that was even possible. "Yes, blood for the dead, only then will they be satisfied." I took a step back, my head spinning. This couldn't be real, it couldn't be happening. Behind us, the banging from the basement grew louder, the whispers more insistent. The dead were coming, and if we didn't act fast, they'd tear through the funeral home, and us, with no mercy. "Ollie," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The funeral home was descending into madness, and time wasn't on our side. The air was alive with whispers and anger, the walls trembling under the weight of it all. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. We had to face this. "We need to split up," Mom said, her voice tight with resolve, though her face betrayed her fear. "That's a terrible idea," I snapped. "It's the only way," she shot back. "If we don't handle this now, they'll tear this place apart, and us with it." Dad nodded grimly, grabbing a crowbar from the wall as if it would do anything against the dead. "Daniel and I will handle the basement. Allison, you and your mother deal with Whitaker. Keep him contained. Do whatever it takes to get him to move on." "Dad." "Go, Allison," he barked, and before I could argue, he and Daniel disappeared down the hallway toward the basement. Mom grabbed my arm, dragging me back into the viewing room where Charles Whitaker sat in his coffin, smiling that awful, predatory smile. His eyes followed us as we entered, glinting with cruel amusement. "You're running out of time," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The others, they're hungry for what you've denied them." "Just tell us what you want," I said, my voice shaking. "What will it take for you to move on?" His grin widened. "The letter, destroy it." I froze. "What? But your rule was to deliver it." "Yes," he said, leaning forward slightly, his glassy eyes locking onto mine. "And now I've changed my mind." My stomach churned. "But if I don't deliver it, they'll know we broke the rules. They'll come for us." Whitaker chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "And if you do deliver it, my family loses everything." "They don't deserve that, do they? My fortune, my legacy, all gone because of a piece of paper." Mom stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "We can't play games with you, Mr. Whitaker. If we break the rules—" "The rules are mine," he interrupted, his voice sharp as a knife. "And I say burn it." The letter was still in my pocket, folded neatly but feeling heavier than anything I'd ever carried. I pulled it out, staring at the crisp envelope with his family's name scrawled on the front. Inside were instructions that would undoubtedly dismantle their wealth, their lives. I looked at Mom, hoping for guidance, but she only stared back at me, her face unreadable. This was my decision. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the lighter on the nearby table. "I'm sorry," I whispered, flicking the flame to life. The paper caught quickly, the edges curling and blackening as the flames consumed it. Whitaker's grin grew impossibly wide, his hollow laughter filling the room as the last of the letter turned to ash. "Good girl," he said, settling back into the coffin, "but it won't be enough." "What do you mean?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. I said I'd move on temporarily," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But the others, they're less forgiving." Before I could respond, a blood-curdling scream echoed from the basement. "Daniel!" I ran from the room without thinking, my heart pounding in my chest. Mom was right behind me, shouting my name, but all I could hear was the sound of my brother's screams and the deafening chaos coming from below. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated. The wood was splintered, the air seeping through cold and foul. I gripped the doorknob, forcing myself to push it open. The sight inside was worse than anything I could have imagined. The revenants had broken free, their grotesque forms shambling and clawing at the walls. Their faces were twisted in rage and despair, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. In the middle of it all was Daniel, pinned to the ground by one of the corpses. Its skeletal hands gripped his shoulders, its jaw unhinged as it leaned closer to him. "Get off him!" I screamed, grabbing a nearby broom and swinging it at the corpse. The wood splintered uselessly against its back, but it was enough to draw its attention. It turned to me, its eyeless sockets burning with rage. "Allison!" Daniel choked out, his voice desperate. Dad appeared out of nowhere, slamming the crowbar into the corpse's head with all his strength. The creature hissed, stumbling backward, but it wasn't enough to stop it. "They won't stop," Mom shouted from behind us. "Not until we give them what they want." "What do they want?" I screamed, my voice breaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Dad, tears streaming down her face. He nodded grimly, stepping forward. "Take Daniel and go," he said. "No," I grabbed his arm. "Dad, you can't. This is my fault," he said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow. "I didn't follow the rules last time. This is on me." Before I could argue, he shoved me toward Daniel. "Go." The basement shook as the revenants advanced, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Dad turned to face them, raising the crowbar like a knight facing an impossible battle. I didn't want to leave him. Every fiber of my being screamed to stay, to fight, to do something. But Mom pulled me back, dragging me and Daniel up the stairs as the basement door slammed shut behind us. The last thing I heard was my father's voice, calm and steady, saying, "Take care of each other." The house felt like it was breathing, exhaling a slow, cold fog as we stood in the viewing room once again. My father was gone. Daniel sat slumped in a chair nearby, his arm in a makeshift sling from where one of the revenants had wrenched it nearly out of its socket. Mom, usually composed, looked hollow, her hands trembling as she clutched the old family Bible, and Charles Whitaker was still in his coffin, watching us. "We're not done yet," he rasped, his grin faint but taunting. I could feel the rage bubbling under my skin. I wanted to scream at him, to demand that he leave, but my mom laid a hand on my shoulder. "Allison," she whispered, her voice brittle but steady, "go to the attic, there's a box. It's marked with a red X, bring it here." "What's in it?" "Just go," she said, her voice brooking no argument. I ran. The attic was a dusty labyrinth of forgotten mementos and old furniture, but the box wasn't hard to find. It sat in a corner, small and unassuming, with a faded red X scrawled on its lid. When I opened it, the contents sent a shiver through me. Black candles, an ancient-looking dagger, and a bundle of yellowed papers covered in cryptic handwriting. I carried it back downstairs, my hands shaking. Mom was already clearing a space on the floor. She didn't explain, didn't hesitate. She lit the black candles, placing them in a circle around the coffin, and began chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Whitaker's grin faltered. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice rising in pitch. "It's what should have been done from the start," Mom said, her eyes blazing. The air grew heavier, pressing down on us like a weight. Whitaker thrashed in his coffin, his glossy eyes wide with panic. "You don't know what you're doing," he shrieked. "Yes, I do," Mom said, her voice cutting through his like steel. "This is our house, you've overstayed your welcome." I didn't know the specifics of the ritual, but I didn't need to. It was ancient, passed down through generations of our family, one final measure to force the dead to move on when nothing else worked. As Mom chanted, the flames of the candles flared, growing impossibly bright. Whitaker's screams echoed through the room, high-pitched and inhuman, until suddenly, silence. The candles extinguished themselves. When I looked at the coffin, it was empty. It was over. Or so I thought. The basement was next. "We can't leave it like this," Mom said, her voice cracking. "If we don't seal it, they'll keep coming." I didn't argue. None of us did. We were too tired, too broken. Together, we descended into the basement one last time. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the walls still scratched and battered from the revenant's fury. Their twisted forms lay crumpled on the floor, motionless but not at peace. Mom pulled out the dagger from the attic box, muttering another chant under her breath. She drew a circle on the floor with salt, sprinkling it around the edges of the room, while Daniel and I stood guard. Dad had been the one to perform these rituals before. Without him, everything felt harder, heavier. When the circle was complete, Mom stepped back, her face pale but resolute. "This will hold them," she said. "For now." "For how long?" I asked. She didn't answer. The next morning, the funeral home was eerily quiet. The air felt lighter, but it wasn't a comforting kind of quiet. It was the kind that came after a storm, when you're left to pick up the pieces. Daniel was nursing his injured arm, sitting silently at the kitchen table. Mom sat across from him, staring at her hands. No one spoke. I stood by the window, staring out at the world beyond the funeral home. For the first time, I truly understood the weight of this place. The rules, the sacrifices, the unspoken truths we carried. I couldn't stay here. That thought, once just a vague dream, had solidified into a certainty. I had to leave. Not just for my sake, but for theirs. This house, this business, it was eating us alive. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at my desk and started planning. Flights, jobs, anything to get me out of here. But as I locked up the funeral home, I heard it, a whisper, faint, but unmistakable, coming from the basement door. "We remember." I froze, my hand gripping the key so tightly it dug into my palm. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to turn away, to walk upstairs and pretend I hadn't heard it. But I knew. The rules weren't done with us yet.